Overview and Scrutiny meeting. This is being broadcast live on YouTube. I'm going to ask members if you can ensure that any mobile phones and other devices are on silent. Please only have your camera on if you're speaking, and please do stay muted unless you're going to speak, because the background noise can be very distracting. This evening we're welcoming officers Adam Davis, Sal Thurloway, and possibly some others, and we're welcoming Ulla Curran-Clark, who is the lead member for Children's Services. Councillors attending this evening, we have Malcolm Richards, Prue Bray, Andrew Mickleborough, Laura Blumenthal, Andy Croy, Ken Mile, I don't think I've missed anyone, have I? Pauline Hellier-Simons, and I'm Alison Swaddle, and I'm chairing the meeting. Members, if we can turn our cameras off, please. Malcolm. To the minutes. Does anyone have any comments of the minutes from the previous meeting?
Yes, please, Alison, if I may.
Yeah, Andrew.
Yep. I've got three queries or requests for updates. On page 9, dashboard item 7, have any reasons been identified for the recent high number of permanent exclusions? On page 10, could we have an update on progress on documenting numbers of children with SEND who are permanently excluded? And I think the request during the previous meeting was also, if possible, eventually for some breakdown by gender and ethnicity. And on page 12, item 50, any progress on possibly sharing some of the data on child exploitation in a part 2 session? Thank you.
Jonathan, are you with us? No?
Hi, Alison. Jonathan is recording the meeting. I can see that Sal's got his hand up, perhaps to answer those questions.
Yeah, thank you, Sal.
Well, it wasn't directly to answer all of the questions, but I shall do my best. Yes, absolutely. We did say that we would provide some quarterly exclusion data, which will take account of the particular groups that you highlight there, Councillor Mickleborough. I'm sure that I can talk to Jonathan and get us something more swiftly than the end of this quarter and share for members of committee as a written response, if that's okay. I'm sure Adam will be able to raise a question in terms of the child exploitation information, and whether we can pull together a paper for colleagues for a future meeting, and as you say, possibly in part 2, dependent on the nature of the content of that paper, i.e. if it happens to identify anybody. The other reason that I had my hand up, if it's okay, Chair, I just noticed 2 small items in terms of the minutes of the last one. One was on page 8, where it suggests that I'd said that we now hired permanent staff. That's new staff, so it's replacement. We are about to go to permanent recruitment, but we haven't.
Okay, I'm afraid I can't hear Sal very clearly. I don't know if it's just my connection.
I have the same problem, Alison.
Okay. Sal, are you with us still?
Now.
Breaking up, isn't it?
Breaking up, yeah. Right, well, in light of Adam, could I ask, we asked that the use of part 2 be explored, and I wondered what progress had been made with that for us to know, have more information.
Yeah, so we can look at getting a data set. I think some of the concerns we had was due to the numbers or low numbers that could be identifiable in terms of the context. So part 2 would definitely be a better option in relation to discussing that in more detail.
Thank you. Are there any other comments on the minutes? Well, sorry, actually, Andrew, did you feel that the points you raised were addressed?
Yes, very happy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Right, declarations. Does anybody have a declaration of interest they need to make? No? Okay, so moving on. Do we have any questions from the public this evening, Luciane?
No, we don't.
Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, I haven't asked. Do we have any apologies this evening?
No, we have all councillors are here.
And do we have any member questions?
No, we haven't received any.
Thank you. So, first item is item 57, a review of the COVID-19 response. This is on pages 17 to 24. For residents watching on YouTube, you can find our agenda and all of the documents if you look on the Woking Borough Council website. Who is with us to lead the presentation?
Evening, Councillor Swaddle, it's Adam Davis here. So I was going to start with this, and then Sal was going to join in the latter part of it. But clearly, you heard earlier that he appears to be having a connection issue, and I know he was earlier in the day, and that might just be a continuation of that now. So this report is a summary really of an overview of children's services in terms of our response to COVID. I'm aware we gave probably a fuller report in November, because that was looking back with how we'd, I suppose, laying out how we'd put in place changes or how we'd adapted our practice across the broad range of services that we offer. And this provides an update on those, and isn't as detailed, but it just gives an update on that position. I wasn't going to go into full detail with it, but I suppose I'll see if there's any questions. But just in summary, just going through it. So throughout COVID, we've continued to report to a number of different forums, which has included the Department of Education, Ofsted. We have regular meetings with Berkshire West Safeguarding Children Partnership, which is our joint safeguarding arrangements with Berkshire West and Reading. And also we've updated the Corporate Parenting Board on our response to looked after children and care leavers. And then, of course, as mentioned earlier, the summary provided here in November. So just touching the headlines of the report, the top bit. So throughout this process, the challenge has been in social care element as balancing the protecting of children and the keeping staff safe. So how do we deliver our statutory duties whilst promoting the welfare of our staff as well? And that's been a challenge that we've responded to and adapted as we've progressed. And I think for social care, the headline for us has been we've managed to sustain and maintain a very high level of direct visits to children, and that was always a priority of ours. And when we look back at the data, that sustained and maintained around 95%. So in particular, child protection visits was an area that we were particularly focused on around how we sustain and maintain those as direct engagements with children. So we did have the opportunity of using virtual visits, and we have used those in some occasions for our looked after children in need, but we were very keen that we ensured that we saw our children subject to child protection plans. The other bit at the top of the report, it talks around the impact of COVID on the work that gets referred to us or shared with us. And we've seen a significant reduction. So we've had 9% reduction of agencies contacting social care. And then out of those ones where we're contacted, the contacts to convert into an assessment or progress into assessment has reduced by about 30%. And what's been interesting is trying to understand that and predict around that. And it's been very challenging. So last year, and we probably discussed this in November, we were expecting an increase after school around October, November, and that never quite came to fruition, never quite occurred as we thought it might do. What's interesting, and it's not in this data, is that in the last couple of weeks we started to see an increase in activity at the front door. So we're starting to see that increase in numbers, and just very early look at it, comparing this Q4 to last year's Q4. So last year's Q4 would have had 1 week within a COVID lockdown period. The numbers of contacts and referrals are higher for this period, which is just interesting and something we're going to keep an eye on. So we've continued to engage with our looked after children and visit them. And as I mentioned earlier, we reported to the Corporate Parenting Board on that, and we've kept them informed on our activity. And in particular, we've continued our engagement and activity with our care leavers. And we were particularly alive to our care leavers around the Christmas period because of the new lockdown requirements that came in and how that impacted on those that may be living independently and their ability to engage and spend time with others. The report also highlights the work of our foster carers and the ongoing care that they provided throughout COVID, and we've been working with them and supporting that. And we've only had to date only one placement that we'd say is linked to COVID that had to end or became destabilised because of COVID. That's a brief. Sorry.
Shall I try and come in on the education side? And apologies for my poor connection, colleagues. So in terms of education, what we've done is we've maintained our ongoing communication and contact with all schools and head teachers. I've continued to send out my daily updates to all head teachers, and we've continued to have weekly roundtable discussions with head teachers and weekly thematic sessions with other senior leaders and teaching staff around various elements as they relate to management of schools and delivery of education in the pandemic context. So we've also worked with schools around ICT and remote learning to ensure that there's the right equipment, that schools have had access to equipment, and to enable families, children to have equipment to support their remote learning. More recently, we've become engaged in delivering the Wellbeing for Education Return programme, which is a programme designed by the DfE in partnership with a number of organisations. It's kind of like a training programme for school staff that we facilitate to support them in terms of the return of children, not just into schools, but the return of them to learning as part of that education return. We've supported schools around the development of the asymptomatic testing, as that's kind of stopped and started, and colleagues will hopefully now be aware that the asymptomatic testing within secondary schools, the secondary school students, is now commenced in earnest since the return of children from the 8th of March. We continue to give access to our school improvement team, to health and safety officers, and also to the council's welfare support systems, because we also recognise and acknowledge the need to support teachers and head teachers' resilience throughout this programme, as much as we do in terms of supporting children and learners. As I've said, we've provided a raft of support in respect of remote learning, not just in terms of the support for equipment, but the support around the systems and guidance around resources in relation to remote learning. And we've had lots of feedback from families, from parents, saying how well the remote learning has gone for the vast majority of students. Another element that colleagues will be well aware of, because we've raised it and discussed it previously within Overview and Scrutiny, is the support and the maintenance support that we've provided, both around free school meals for children whilst they've been in lockdown and therefore not attending school, as well as home to school transport arrangements, and maintaining those for the eligible children when we were in broader lockdown, and making sure that we can very quickly re-stand up our transport arrangements when schools reopen to all learners. So we've done a lot of work both with our schools, with families, and also our commissioned providers to make sure that we've kept on top of the free school meals and the home to school transport agendas. And then again, this is an area across both children's social care and education, working across with our health partners around supporting emotional well-being for children and young people. So not exclusively just for those at school. We've co-commissioned and engaged COOTH, which is the online counselling and emotional wellbeing support service for young people aged 11 to 18, which in essence is an online counselling service. And we've also provided and signposted our primary sector colleagues to resources and materials that are age appropriate for that cohort too, given that the online counselling isn't geared up for those early years age groups. So we've also been minded to the emotional well-being of children and young people generally. I don't know whether Adam wants to come back in and share with us around some of the challenges and the context that's provided for us as well.
You, that's first time. At the bottom of the report, so there's a summary really of the challenges and what's gone well or what's worked well in the current context. I mentioned earlier it was balancing the adaptations as a real challenge in terms of promoting staff welfare and keeping children safe. The predictive modelling has been a real challenge in terms of understanding the themes and trends, the patterns of referrals. We've had some cases of note that we've been responding to, and it's very difficult to identify a pattern or a theme with those. Balancing, obviously mitigating the change for workers working from home and how that sort of loss of team and that sort of presence in the building. Since the further lockdown in December, we reduced the number of staff we had at our offices, and that was in response to the new variants. And what we're doing now is looking at how we start unravelling that really and bringing people back into places of work, because we think that teams are important for social workers in terms of supporting their practice and development. And then a summary of what's worked well. We've had amazing commitment from our staff, the ability to adapt and change their approach to work. We've had great IT support that's enabled us to work remotely. We've maintained COVID compliant office space where we have had staff in location. We've provided PPE regularly to staff, and we now have a good supply of that. High level of face-to-face visits, as I was mentioning earlier, and we've continued to regularly update and publish our practice standards, which are COVID related. So every time there's a change in the context or the situation of advice, we update our practice standards, and particularly we did that pre-Christmas with the further lockdown. We've got some mental health first aiders as part of the staff team, and that really is, I suppose, a sort of summary really of some of the positives, but there obviously there's more details within the document itself.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Sal. I'm sure the members have all read the document and will have some questions. Can I just kick off by asking you, what could we have done better?
Is that general social care or education, or?
Oh, no, I'm not. I don't expect you to answer education.
I think, crikey, it's very difficult looking back, because I think of the various different times we've been in with the different lockdowns and the different tier systems that we've been in. I think we did I think areas we did very well in was maintaining and sustaining our visits to children. And Bridges, our resource for children with disabilities, we kept open. I think that the challenge we're seeing now is I suppose some of the impact of working in this way for a year, and we've had a number of staff who've been impacted by COVID through illness or the longer term impacts of that. And I think it's that challenge to keep covering off those staff gaps, maybe those vacancies, in terms of keeping that recruitment, because you don't want to over recruit, but then you need to have a nimble workforce to recruit in terms on an interim basis to cover those gaps. But the staff team's been very flexible in covering off some of those gaps in terms of in ensuring that children are seen. But it's very, looking back, it feels like a long journey we've been through in terms of those different stages, and looking back to the summer where things started to sort of become more normal again, to where we are now. It just feels like a long year, really, looking back.
I think from an education perspective, I think one of the key successes for us was how quickly we responded in terms of gearing up for support for schools and settings. I suppose one of the things we probably could have done better is taken a little bit more stock at the start, because right at the beginning of the pandemic, I think that there were initially sometimes when we were caught up in the speed of change as it was coming out from central government and everywhere else, and what was happening locally. And I think that, in terms of doing better, if we paced ourselves a little better at the beginning, I think that would have paid a bit more dividend. However, I think that it was right that we got engaged with our schools straight off the bat, really.
Thank you. Laura, would you like to ask a question?
Thank you. I've got 3 questions, but I promise they'll be quick. So the first one is about Couth, which is such an exciting initiative to support our young people with their mental health. Do we know if we're looking at the uptake, the success of it, feedback from young people? Because that would be really useful for us to know.
So there was a data set on this that I don't have before me, which I believe we shared, and I'm trying to think whether it was the Corporate Parenting Board or following this meeting that was shared. But it has been, I would say, successful in its rollout in terms of take up. Yeah. I don't have those numbers to hand.
So we do have some of that which we can share. I think the difficulty will be about sharing feedback from service users, as given that it's a confidential line, it's not something that we go out and overtly try and capture.
Sure, it's just to understand if this is an effective tool to actually help our young people with their mental health. So if you could share that would be fantastic, just so we can see and understand and what we could do going forward. My second question was on providing school children with laptops. Was it the case that every child who needed a laptop for home learning got one?
So in terms of the laptop provision, we accessed, or the schools with our support accessed, all of the provision that was available to them from the Let's Get Technology scheme, which was run by the DFE. The criteria for accessing the laptops was in essence the eligibility for free school meals criteria. So it was very much targeted at those groups where there is greater social disadvantage, and therefore the likelihood of having laptops and such like was likely to be lower. So it's a very targeted response. As a council, through the virtual school, we ensured that all of our looked after children also had a laptop, and that's been a long-standing provision that we make for our looked after learners. And we expanded it slightly to some of our early years children throughout the COVID pandemic. I would suggest that, yes, we managed to get, and schools managed to get, laptops to the vast majority of children that needed them. And for those where either the access to technology or the quiet space to use it was problematic, the eligibility for accessing school site provision during the lockdown pandemic was also offered to those groups as well, to ensure that there was the availability of on-site provision for children that might have had challenges in accessing remote learning, so that we didn't disrupt children's learning.
Brilliant, that's great to hear, thank you. And then on page 22, there were a couple of sentences I didn't really understand the context of. So it was about home to school transport, and it said, in respect to home to school transport, we've had to be agile in our response to lockdowns where they've affected school attendance. And I didn't know if that meant that children who would have been physically taken to school before weren't attending school virtually, if that increased.
Yeah, so the home to school transport question was around us being agile in our commissioning and with our providers. So when lockdown occurred, a large proportion of children that would normally be transported to school were staying at home and accessing remote learning. And so we had to work with our commissioning providers in order to stand down transport so that we weren't purchasing taxis for children that were staying at home and doing their remote learning at home. And then when things opened again, very quickly stand up that provision again. So the challenge was more about how we worked with our transport providers, taxi companies and coach companies, and the challenge inherent in that, in standing them up and down quickly, rather than any concern for children's learning, either as eligible students to be on school sites or for those students learning through the remote packages.
Okay, great. Good to know. It's just a misinterpretation on my behalf. Thank you.
Carol, did you want to come in there?
Thanks, Alison. Apologies for my lateness. I was in another meeting. It wasn't in relation to homeschool transport, Laura. It was in relation to the laptops. So we also utilised the council-wide scheme, which was when we asked the general public to provide laptops that would needed refurbishing. So some of our children benefited from that scheme as well, if they didn't benefit from the other schemes. And then the other group that we also made sure that we paid attention to in relation to either accessibility, so dongles to strengthen their Wi-Fi, or actual physical laptops, were our young carers. So we also did a piece of work very, very early on into the pandemic to make sure that our young carers were also catered for in relation to their IT equipment or network coverage. That was the only thing that I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol.
Ola, Corinne, did you want to add something there?
Yes, please. I am able to answer Laura's questions about CORE. During the period of 1st of July 2020 to 2020, and across the borough, we had 1,606 log. We had 392 new registrations, 61 chats with court counsellors, 626 therapeutic messages exchanged, 364 article reviews, and 1,934 forum views. And the majority of the new registrations were in the age bracket 11 to 13. 71% of logins were outside core office hours, with between 7 to 9 p.m. being the most popular hours. And walking 7% of all new logins across. I hope that answers your questions, Laura.
Yeah, that's really useful. And have we captured any feedback on how effective the young people have felt it has been? So from 0 to 10, how useful do you think this has been to support you with your mental health?
As far as I'm aware, we haven't done any survey.
Is that something we could perhaps look into?
I'm sure we can. That would be very interesting to see how helpful they have found it after having been given.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been operating around about 8 months now. So it came into, it's about last year, I think it was last July that we launched it, June or July. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, certainly we can have a conversation with the CCG, who are obviously the main contributor on behalf of all 3 boroughs, and then each borough has contributed equally. to see whether or not they've got, it may already be in the contract, so we just need to kind of look at what's in the contract in relation to feedback from young people. So yes, certainly something we can take forward.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thank you. Andrew, would you like to present your questions?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Adam and Sal, for your presentation. It was Sal who referred to a raft of support, and there's plenty of evidence provided both in the written report and also in your oral presentation tonight, of that. So thank you very, very much to everybody, who's been involved in providing, all of those varied supports. I'd like to ask 3 questions, if I may, and I'd like to ask them separately as they're quite discrete issues. The first area is to do with potential concerns that the pandemic might be having an impact on the development of children, particularly of young children, perhaps, who might, for instance, be interacting less with other children through playgroups, less visits to other family members, etc. And I noted on page 23 that there was a reference to a £100,000 grant for early years provision. What specifically is that grant for? And might it, any of that be directed towards this particular issue on developmental impacts on children?
Thank you very much, Councillor Mickleborough. In terms of the developmental question, this is an area that we are and we continue to explore, and there's lots of work that's being undertaken both nationally as well as some work that's taken regionally, really to try and understand it. Clearly, what lockdown or the initial lockdown did was it reduced the face-to-face contact within early years settings. However, this most recent lockdown, that wasn't the case because all early years settings remained open to all of their children. And what we know is that there was a continued large take-up of that provision. So that bit around the social interaction for many early years children within settings is one that in the latter lockdown period had less impact. Clearly, the impact around seeing extended family members or family friends outside of early years settings will have been something that will impact on children as it will their whole families. We're trying to really dig deep and understand what the actual impact is in terms of any developmental delays that the COVID scenario might have seen. We have done some survey work with, for example, some of our schools in order to start to understand, well, what's the impact? And we know that what we're seeing is that children and young people, some of the language comprehension or language usage seems to have slowed down, which again is suggestive that in a school setting where lockdown has meant that you've not come into the environment, so you're not interacting with your peers and your teachers, it has had some impact. And that the work that I was talking about before in terms of the recovery programme that the DFE and Anna Freud Centre and others have developed is part of that response to those things. How do we make sure that we're able to re-engage children in learning upon return, both in terms of their re-engagement within the setting, given that they will have been out of the setting for so long, as well as the kind of catch-up activity that we're all kind of hearing about snippets about on the news. So it is an area that we're really, really conscious of. I think it's a bit early just yet to be able to definitively say it's had X impact or Y impact, but it's certainly something we're watching. In terms of the grant question, we did identify a £100,000 grant, and this was to support provision in order to prevent early years setting closures. So it's very much more a business grant than it was around supporting individual children. it's really pleasing to note that the vast majority of settings have managed to make sure that they are continue to be sustainable. They've made best use of all the government schemes in the first instance, and actually there's been a low demand or call on the Wokingham Borough Council grant fund, but it is there should those settings need it in order to support their longer term sustainability.
Thank you very much for that. Can I just confirm that the £100,000 that you referred to, it's grants, is it? It's not loans to... No, it's grants.
It is a grant scheme that's been provided.
Wonderful. I'll just ask one more question, if I may. On page 18, there's a reference to the greater complexity of cases, in particular that there doesn't seem to be any clear pattern to this. I'm assuming this is no pattern in terms of reasons and or effects. This is a specific reference to the pandemic. I'm just wondering whether this lack of clear pattern that was developing was also true pre-pandemic, and is the lack of clear pattern to this increase in complexity and the growing number of new contacts. You mentioned earlier this evening about the increase in number of front door calls, for example, and so forth. Are the combination of these two things, increasing complexity without a clear pattern behind that, and increasing calls on services, are there any potential reasons to be concerned about this?
I think when you're a small local authority like we are, you don't have the probably number or throughput to probably get those patterns that other authorities may see. So talking to some colleagues or peers from across the country, a number of local authorities saw an increase in adolescents who were coming via the front door and then maybe becoming looked after and coming into care. We never saw that. So when you have a particular case of note where there's a particular incident, the local authority has a duty to refer that to the national panel. And we've across the safeguarding partnership, there's been a significant increase in those number of cases that have been referred. Now, whilst there might be a theme in the age and stage of development of those children, there's no other themes really that are identifiable across that area. So it's very difficult when we've tried to analyse those sort of cases of note or those cases with additional complexities. The outcome we really came to was that we just need to be alert and curious around all cases that contact us, because there's no specific theme or pattern that we're picking up. So when what we have done is we've looked at increasing our resources to work with or to support the work of social workers of those children who are under 5, under 1. So if you think about a child who's just coming up to their first birthday, spent the whole year within this COVID context, and going back to the point you were making earlier around they've probably had limited contact with those support networks that a child or family would ordinarily have during that period of their development.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Okay, Carol.
Thank you. It was just your earlier point, Andrew. Public Health England are also doing a national piece of work in relation to very young children, not babies, but between sort of 1 and 3, those children where the impact of social isolation on child development may be prevalent. But as Sal said, it's a bit early to kind of predict anything, but they are launching a sort of national research in that area, because obviously that falls into the public health arena as well, in terms of looking at the whole population. So that's just another bit of information for you. So we will get information about that as it develops.
Yeah, that's really good to know. Thanks.
Hey, members, does anybody else have any questions on this report of our COVID response? Okay, we've been asked.
It's Prue. Can I just say one thing?
Yes, go ahead.
Which is nothing about the quality of the report, but obviously at council last week, we discussed the council's response to COVID and the overview and scrutiny report. And it's just a slight shame that we didn't have a chance to have this meeting to discuss children's services bit before the council had its chance to discuss the Risk Council's overall response. That it would have been nice to do it the other way around. It's just not possible, but it's a shame because it kind of.
Well, this report is more of an update because the
yes, I know.
But been through us
yeah.
to go to ONS management, to go to exec, to go to council. So this is a more recent report.
Yeah, I know. It's just you feel my feeling. I'm not critical exactly, but it's just the situation keeps changing. And so, yeah.
I think that is the enormous challenge that Carol, Adam, Sal, they don't know what's going to happen. We could all go back into lockdown at May half term and
please.
I did just have one question. I've heard wonderful things about the way that lateral flow testing is happening in our secondary schools. The children and the parents have felt it's been introduced very well. I just wanted to ask, are all of our staff in our primary schools doing twice weekly rapid tests?
Again, I don't have the actual figures, but I do understand that there is a good take-up in terms of lateral flow testing with staff, and that's both in terms of primary as well as now in our early years settings.
Oh, right. So that's optional. It's not something that's required of staff.
No, the asymptomatic testing and lateral flow testing is optional and consent-based for everybody, because in essence it is a medical procedure in as much as you're how do I say it politely, inserting things into places to get matter that can then be tested. So it has to be done on a consensual basis. What we do know is that take-up in Wokingham has been, I would use the word phenomenal. I think it's been a really, really good take-up, as we've seen in our secondary schools. We know that staff across secondary, primary and early years settings are taking up those opportunities for testing, and we're beginning to see the greater rollout for families with school-age children also taking up the opportunity in terms of the testing arrangements that are now available to them as well.
That's excellent news. I must say, when I hear about some of the practices in other boroughs, just overwhelmingly proud of your team and everything you're doing. Very, very appreciative. I think you've done a fantastic job. I understand Addington has been open every day, but it should be children getting full education. They're not simply there for childcare. Sadly, I haven't heard that from special schools in our neighbours. So I'd just like to say well done and thank you to everybody, and please pass that on to all of the officers within children's services.
Thank you, Alex. And I think it's also, I know Adam's mentioned it, but our resource centre for children with disabilities, Bridges, has also remained open throughout the whole period, and as over that period, a huge number of children have been able to access services, which has given families, the support they need, so that those family situations have not escalated or broken down. It is amazing. Our staff have been amazing.
Yes, absolutely. I spoke to Autism Berkshire recently, and they said that in Woking Borough we have been doing a fantastic job. Parents really, really appreciated all the support. Okay, so let's move on to the next item on the agenda, which is item 58, when we're looking at diversity and equality in schools. So that's, are you going to be presenting this, Carol or Sal?
Sal.
I'll do my best at presenting this. Unfortunately, a colleague from our school improvement team was hopefully going to join us because they've been doing a lot of the work, but unfortunately they've got some personal family issues that they need to attend to this evening. However, in terms of the report, hopefully colleagues have had an opportunity to read through it. And one of the things that we were really keen to respond to was the issues that were being raised in respect of ethnicity, Black Lives Matter, and that whole equity agenda within schools. And we very quickly wanted to really explore with our schools what we meant by racial equity. And we were really keen to talk about racial equity rather than purely equality of opportunity. I think it was an area that both fitted what was happening at that time, so it gave us a real platform to work with schools. But it was also really important that we address the issues for children and young people, for staff, and also for previous students that had shared their experiences with us about education as a Black student or a student from a BAME community. So we started in the summer term of last year engaging with schools through our newsletters, through the Governor's newsletter, and through drop-in sessions to really start to share with them resources that were available to help them explore these issues with their pupils and students in an age-appropriate way. But then also met with a teacher that had a particular experience and shared that openly with us and with others about her own experiences, and helped us to think through how schools from an educationalist perspective can move to becoming much more anti-racist or establishments of racial equity. And through that, we started to develop a kind of a work plan and thinking around the way in which we should operate. When we moved into the autumn term, so in September, we'd spent the time starting to work things up and started to work out the basis principles that we wished to operate to. And we were really clear that actually the key principles had to be about working in partnership. It wasn't about anybody being seen to be the professional in this area, because equity is about understanding everybody's differential experience, and therefore people are the expert in their own experiences. So making sure that we were working in partnership rather than just delivering something to people. What we wanted to do really had to start to have a desire to affect that change, that actually it wasn't just about responding to a popular agenda. It was actually about seeking change for the better. And the other another element of the principles was about understanding ourselves as officers of the council, or as teachers, or as school support staff, and understanding our own understandings, really, and exploring our own understandings of racism and where we fit into that system, and how our understanding of such things can influence the way in which we and organisations behave. So that kind of personal learning and reflection was a key foundation for undertaking this work. We kind of focused it around three key areas. So one was around learning, and that was about, that racial literacy. That's about understanding, about our awareness, and how we support children as well as staff to be aware and to understand what's going on in their schools, what's going on in their communities, what's going on through history. So that knowledge piece around equity, racial justice, was really, really important. The second of the key aims was around really wanting to see outcomes, so linked back to that principle of really wanting to see change, and actually starting to think about where are we seeing the difference as it relates to different ethnic groups or racial groups, and therefore what's the activity that we need to do in order to respond to those differences. And then the final area was really about understanding our workforce and starting to think about what as a system we can be doing to making sure that we have a really diverse workforce that's working with our diverse schools communities, so that provision is shaped by that diversity as well. So we've been going through a whole raft of work with schools. We've undertaken some survey activity with schools, and you'll have found in the papers the survey responses, which started to give us a really, really good flavour as to where do we think we need to go, where are the things that we need to focus on, which helped us to develop and be part of the developing around our training strategy and sort of the sessions that we want to hold with the key stakeholders. And so during this spring term, we've been starting to do workshops with teachers, with school staff, with governors around that understanding piece, because that's going to be a real foundation for this long-term piece of work, piece of change work, really. We do want to build on the expertise that's in there, but our strategy has to be founded on that sharing of good practice, which comes through people's experience and their lived experience of racial equity or inequity, and thinking about how we work towards shifting inequity towards equity. So we're also thinking, as I said, about the underpinning issues and starting to think about the differential impact that happens for children of different racial groups. And one area that we're looking at is, for example, fixed terms exclusions and how that has a differential impact, and therefore what is it that's happening within the school's environment that's leading to that. What is it about schools' policies and processes that might be, and I say might, be having an impact in the differential rates in terms of exclusion, dependent on which ethnic minority group you may come from. So starting to really think about what that data is telling us, and what do we know about where it's happening, in order to really explore what we need to do in order to respond to some of those things, which, like I say, can be about policy, but it can also be about a whole raft of other things that are informally influences the way in which organisations work. We know that this is, the start of a long journey for us as a school system, and it's really not that we feel that there is an epidemic or problem in relation to race within our schools, but actually we absolutely acknowledge that to achieve racial equity within our schools, there is a big piece of work for us to do with the school system, and we're just at the start of that journey. So hopefully I've done that justice. My colleague, who was hopefully going to be here, would have done it much better than I, but I'm happy to try and take whatever questions and respond to them that you might have.
And if we can't answer the questions, then we will take them offline and come back to you.
Okay, Andy Croy.
Thank you, and thank you, Sal, for that presentation and for the work I can see has gone on over the last 9 months or so. Now, I think we originally arranged this in this committee, and we originally focused on one issue, and that was the issue of measuring racism in our schools and the inability of the borough to compare incidents of racism between schools because of the different standards that were used by different schools. So in effect, the borough has no idea what's going on in its schools. That was what I had hoped this report would be about. That's not to devalue all the excellent work that's happened, but it seems to me, unless I've missed something or unless there's another work stream that you haven't told us about, that at the moment we're no closer to knowing that. I had a look at the website earlier. That used to be that in the schools hub part of the website, it actually said we can't make comparisons between the different schools in terms of the reporting of racist incidents because of the different standards that are used in the schools. I can't find that text anymore. So I think the first thing I'd like is some reassurance that that text hasn't been vanished and it still sits somewhere. And I would also like to know when we're going to get an update on the work that has to be done to ensure that comparisons can be made between schools. Because if we can't compare what's going on between schools, well, that to me seems to be the foundation of any work to tackle racism in the schools. So we just don't know what's going on. So there's two questions there.
Yeah, and Andy, I do recognise what you're saying in terms of that measurement question that was raised before, and I'm sorry that this report hasn't responded to that in the way that you were expecting. Unfortunately, some years ago, the responsibility for schools to report to the local authority racist incidents that had occurred was removed, and therefore there's no longer a compulsion for schools to report to us. There is a requirement that as part of their reporting, schools have to report into their governing or trust body arrangements around racist incidents, but they're not obliged to share them with the local authority. However, in saying that, we feel that as part of this broader work, which is exploring racial equity and what it means, will help us in developing the relationship with schools around consistency of approach. And hopefully at some point we will start to introduce the question around shared reporting and recording. But it is a real challenge for us. And at the moment, we have no mechanism by which we can, other than our influence, by which we can get that information from schools in a inconsistent way.
I know, and we knew this, I think, last summer when it was first raised, and we knew that the schools were, or some schools were reporting this on their annual reports or their governor's reports. We know that this isn't new. The project must surely is to engage with schools to make sure they are using a consistent standard and that to encourage them to publish the results. And if schools won't publish the results, then that's a problem. It's fantastic that schools do publish results, and that they're being open about it. And if schools aren't being open about it, then people need to know. If we've got a cesspit of racism somewhere, then people need to know about it. And at the moment, we don't know. And you can tell I'm not particularly happy. And if schools don't want to engage, well, you know what, name and shame. I appreciate officers can't do that, but I will do that happily, because it is not acceptable. Measurement of the problem and acknowledgement of the problem needs to be a first step. And we can't progress just by hoping that schools that are willing might publish some data if it doesn't make them look too bad.
So, Sal, would you say that the borough has an ambition? We are determined that is the course that you want to take, rather than we're hoping schools will.
Again, I think it is really important that we're able to have that empirical understanding of what's happening across the system. And so, yeah, absolutely, we would have an ambition whereby there is a consistent approach to our understanding of racist incidents within schools and a common way in which we could understand that data. And part of the way in which we're seeking to develop this racial equity in work with the school system is about making sure that we have a consistent understanding. The difficulty and the challenge that we have is that we cannot require schools to engage or to directly share with us as the local authority. But what we can do is work with schools about their understanding of racial equity and why it's important that there is a consistent approach within the school system.
Sal, the borough used to have that statement saying that we could not compare the different statistics provided by schools as the schools used different, had different thresholds for what wasn't reported. Has that been removed from the borough's website? Do you know?
I'd need to look into that, Andy. I'm not aware.
Because, I mean, there have obviously been some considerable revisions around the issues of race in schools, and we can see that with the new documents, which is fine. But it looks in doing that this awkward truth about what we can't report on has been taken away. And if it has been taken away, that is very, very worrying, because we can't hide our weaknesses. We cannot hide the gaps in our armour. And I remember back in oh Christ, it must have been the early 90s. With death in the playground and the recommendations which came out of that. And the basic thing is you've got to be able to measure it. And if the government has taken away the requirements for schools to report it, then we need to be encouraging. That doesn't make it a good thing. That doesn't make it acceptable. We need to be trying to roll that back using persuasion, using whatever. And at the moment, I'm not seeing that, and I'm furious, frankly.
Well, Andy, if maybe outside of this meeting, if you want to share with me where on the website that's appeared before, I will absolutely chase it down. It's certainly not been an active decision on Children's Services to remove anything from the website at all. I'll happily look into that for you.
If it's still there, I apologise, but I haven't been able to find it. I will show you the part of the website where I think it should be.
Thank you.
Do you have any questions on the report presented, Andy?
Just a very, very quick one. I mean, I was disappointed to see that I think it was just 30 schools responded to the questionnaire. Is that, I appreciate you can't make schools respond, so I would just like an indication of, is that the normal level of response we would get for a non-compulsory return?
Again, I don't think that's an abnormal response. I'll check with my school improvement team. I think just the little bit of context that we do also need to take into account is that this was done and this is being done while schools are also responding to the pandemic and the changes that they've had to make within that, which may have also affected the returns.
Yes, I understand that. Thank you.
Okay.
Perhaps give someone else a go now, Alison.
Okay, Andrew.
Yes, thanks very much. I'd like to ask 3 or 4 questions, but just before I begin, I'd like to ask for some clarification on some of the things that Andy has just raised. Have I understood it correctly that there's no longer a requirement for schools to report racist incidents to WBC, but that schools are required to report this to their governing bodies? And if so, if they are reporting to their governing bodies, is there already some form of national reporting framework stating exactly what should be reported with consistent standardised terminologies, thresholds for reporting, that kind of thing? And does the reporting of racist incidents, or should it include incidents affecting staff and parents as well as pupils? So just a few points of clarification firstly.
In terms of standardisation of reporting, I don't believe that there is a national standard or framework for reporting. There will be some guidance for schools. in respect of racist reporting, which I'm more than happy to seek out and provide for you, Andrew. But I don't believe that there is a formalised national framework for reporting in respect of that. However, I would understand that racist incident reporting will encompass staff at school and parents where the school is made aware.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I have three questions about the report itself. The descriptors used to record ethnicity seem to be pretty standard, but I suspect that they might be too broad brush to capture the realities of some individuals and households. For instance, is the data that we have able to identify households where there may be children with different ethnicities in the same household, which may in itself sometimes give rise to particular needs and challenges? And also, and this is not a criticism of the report or the data presented, but I believe the challenges facing some of the children are really multi-layered. Ethnicity may be a factor, significant factor, but often other interlinked factors such as socioeconomic status, housing, family structure may also play significant roles. Are there any plans going forward to do more to effectively incorporate such factors in the analysis and the responses along with ethnicity?
I think if I can take the second part of that question first, if I may. Absolutely, there will be a number of other socioeconomic or other factors that are playing into these children's lives. So want to be really, really clear that the provision of this data within the report isn't to suggest that actually being black Caribbean or minor white and black Caribbean or any of the other characteristic groups there is and of itself the issue. What this was or the reason that we've been exploring it in this way is to show that actually there is a disproportionate impact in terms of certain ethnic minority groups, and we need to really start to explore that. And you're absolutely right to suggest that as we explore that, we'll be taking in a number of other factors into account. And those factors will not only be related to those individual children's and their family circumstance or their family's characteristics, but it will also be about the characteristics of schools, their policies and procedures and how they approach things like fixed term exclusion, and starting to understand whether there's any unforeseen bias in those sorts of arrangements as well. And that's what it means to do that whole racial equity piece. So it's not just about saying there is a problem with this particular group. It's actually what are all of the things that are impacting in such a way that there is a disproportionate evidential impact on those groups, and therefore what do we need to do about it? In terms of your first question, Andrew, around what do we know about the makeup of households where they may have children or family members that come from a number of those different groups, I'm afraid our data doesn't necessarily go into that level of granularity as it will relate to the exclusions of individual students rather than the data that relates to their families. The closest indication, I suppose, that we will get to some of that will be, the feedback that we know from our population data, and the census that hopefully colleagues took part in on Sunday, and those sorts of things that will give us a greater understanding of population.
Okay, thank you for that. And two other quick, shorter questions, if I may. You've alluded tonight and also in the report to the considerable overrepresentation of Black Caribbean and mixed Caribbean white children, which is replicated in many, many other parts of the country. Are these, and I'm referring to the to exclusions here, sorry, are these predominantly boys? And are they in particular age groups? Are there any gender issues involved here? And are there any lessons that could be learned from other parts of the country that have had success in addressing this issue that might, that might be adapted here in our borough?
I'm afraid, Andrew, I don't have that detailed information right in front of me at the moment. Again, I can provide you with some information that in relation to gender and exclusion data, but I'm afraid I don't have that to hand right in front of me just at this moment.
Mm-hmm. No, I understand. And finally, it's an observation and a possible request. I noted in the response from the schools quite a number of very interesting initiatives. For example, one school has appointed a racial equity governor. There's another reference to school appointing a parent support advisor. I think these are really interesting, potentially really interesting, initiatives. You mentioned the forthcoming workshops with head teachers and other teachers. I think the next one being spring term workshop on the 29th of March. These sound really interesting, and I'm just wondering whether it's, and tell me if it's inappropriate for me to ask this, but whether it might be possible for one or two members of this Overview and Scrutiny Committee to actually observe those workshops, because I think this is a really, really interesting initiative.
I'm more than happy, Andrew, to go back to those that are convening the workshops and potentially see whether we could get a workshop put together for members in order to engage if observing isn't an option. But I'll certainly ask the question of those that are convening the workshops.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Andrew. Laura, you had your hand up next.
Thank you. Thank you, Sal, for presenting this to us. I had a few questions, 3 questions about exclusions in particular. But I think obviously this whole document is still quite early days, so it will be good to find out a bit more when there's been a strategy fleshed out and perhaps bring it back to this this forum, but we can discuss that later with the Forward programme. So on exclusions, do we have an overall target for exclusions for our children? Because the data shows that the vast majority of ethnic groups that aren't white British actually do better on exclusions. So I was just wondering if we're being ambitious enough, pegging it to white British.
I'm not sure that we have specific targets in terms of exclusions. Clearly, we want to work with all schools to reduce all fixed-term exclusions. We're doing a whole piece of work with the school system at the moment called therapeutic thinking, which is an approach which is kind of senior leader-led and cascaded down in terms of thinking about how we manage behaviours and support schools in order to reduce exclusions. And it's had a quite significant impact in other authorities that have used it. So again, like I say, I'm not sure that necessarily we have a specific target in relation to exclusions.
Okay, interesting to know. Thank you. And then, do we have a specific criteria for excluding children that is just based on behaviours? So there isn't any threat of bias or subjectivity coming in, or is that something being worked on?
Yeah. So each school will have its own policy. So each school will hold its own behaviour policies and will have its own exclusion arrangements. However, when a school is seeking to exclude, there is education welfare support service that are engaged to ensure that things like that exclusion is legal, that it's appropriate and robust, and we can provide support for parents in those, and also provide challenge to schools where it's appropriate to do so. Sorry,
I think you broke off a little bit.
My apologies.
So the exclusion policies and criteria, is it not being looked at as part of this project?
Yeah, I think that they will be. This project isn't solely, but that was a particular area where there was a stark contrast, so it made sense to highlight that. But yeah, I think exclusions will all be part of the broader piece of work that we're doing.
Okay, that's brilliant. And then finally, as I said, the vast majority of ethnic groups seem to perform better than white British on exclusions. Are we going to be doing a lot of targeted, tailored support to help the groups that do need support, which seem to be Irish, Gypsy, Roma and Black Caribbean? Because I was just a bit concerned in the paragraphs after the table with the data, it just said really that we'll do some work to try to get people to understand bias, which privileges white people, where our data are not more complex than that. And I just wanted to check that there was going to be targeted support for this group.
Yeah, well, I think that the whole premise of this piece of work is really to understand what's going on institutionally that might be having that impact, what's going on at an individual personal level that might be having differential impacts, but it will also absolutely have to explore what are the support needs that will be prevalent for particular minority groups, and whether that's a play into some of this as well. So it's very holistic in its nature. Like I say, it's fairly early days, so there's still lots of development, and as I'm probably, in all honesty, probably doing it a bit of a disservice, as colleagues that are closer to it could have provided a much more coherent narrative than I. But I do know that we're right at the start of this piece of work, and I think that it will, have quite reaching ramifications in terms of how it seeks to move towards that racial equity in school, because it's such a massive area for us to explore and respond to. It's not just one thing that you switch on and everything's turned around. There are all sorts of things that we need to explore in this.
I thought there'd be more to the plan than what was just there, so I just wanted to check. Thank you, Sal.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Prue.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Sal. There's an awful lot more to school exclusions than this, and the government guidance has a paragraph somewhere near the beginning which talks very helpfully about how certain ethnic groups are more at risk of exclusion than others, but then provides you with no clue what to do about that. But it also makes the point that children with the SEND I don't know, I was going to say diagnosis, also are at greater risk of exclusion. And I wondered whether the work you're going to do is what other factors you're going to look at that might correlate with this, whether there are, what the proportions are with different diagnoses such as autism or ADHD or learning difficulties or whatever it is that people might have. And also attendance. I think Andrew mentioned what I'll call in the short term is poverty, the less well off, but there's also family support and the way that operates. It could be a minefield. It could also be an extremely beneficial way to start opening our eyes to the way different circumstances affect different children, and to try to overcome some of the differences that create a playing field that's unequal for people. So I was wondering if you give us an idea of timescales and what you're going to explore and look at.
So, if I can, I think you've really touched on the complexity of the whole environment, and this is one piece of work specifically focused around racial equity. As you'll be aware, there is another piece of work around our innovation and improvement agenda around our arrangements for children with SEND.
Yeah, I was actually thinking of it in the context of race, so that whether there was one of the reasons that for example, there's a 13.8% something in one group was because that there are more children in that ethnic grouping with a particular SEND diagnosis, for example, and whether that is a thing. Do you know what I mean?
So that's, yeah, no, I do know what you mean. Thanks for the clarification.
Yes.
So I don't have that level of detail now. I will ask of the team to ensure that they are considering those things as they do that exploration, really, to understand the context.
And the other thing is about age, because we could do with a breakdown of the age for the fixed term exclusion so that we can understand that a bit more, particularly the split between primary, well between key stages, really, I suppose. Yep, that would be really...
Absolutely. But I think, again, I'd just like to flag that the piece of work here is not just exclusively around the impact and the impact it has on exclusion rates. That was just a really good and graphic example to share in terms of the types of things that this project is going to be exploring.
I totally get that this is the beginning of a journey, and I think it's something that we should have perhaps focused on a bit earlier, but I'm glad we're focusing on it now.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Prue. Thanks, Sal. Pauline.
Thank you. So every school is supposed to have an anti-bullying policy. Have we got access to those policies for all of our schools, including the academies? And can we therefore check whether that anti-bullying policy makes any specific mention of racial bullying? And if it doesn't, are we in a position to suggest that they do include something and perhaps to work with them on what they can say?
So you're absolutely correct, Pauline, that each school does have to have its own policy arrangements, and schools should be sharing those policies on their websites, so they ought to be accessible to us. And in terms of being able to provide some guidance and some support to schools, I think that's some.
So do you know whether many schools have got a racial consistency? Sorry, I thought you finished.
No, that's fine. Having not gone through each. Sorry, I missed that. Having not gone through each individual policy as yet, I'm not sure exactly what the content will be, and it's likely to be varied school by school. But as I said, I think that as a local authority, we can provide some helpful advice to schools on how they construct their policies in order to make sure that they are taking full account of different characteristics.
Could perhaps one of your colleagues do a check on all of their websites to see exactly what those policies say, and if there isn't much in relation specifically to racial harassment, maybe just make some suggestions to them?
Absolutely, I can put that through into my school improvement team.
Super, thank you very much, Sal.
You're muted, Alison.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Pauline. Thank you, Sal. Andy, did you want to pick up on something here?
Thank you. Yes. Just to say, Sal, and everyone else, that I've actually, while people were talking, I went and checked the website again, and this time I could find the statement and the documents I was looking for. So apologies if I inferred that they'd been taken away, because they haven't, and they're still there. While looking at the documents, though, it's obvious. You can see that one of them is a document which is basically a racist incident monitoring form, and it's dated. It seems to be dated 2011, so it's 10 years old. But I'm not sure if we need a new one. It seems to me this would be a really good place to start if we want schools to record incidents in a consistent way. Perhaps something we should be doing is asking schools, well, how are you recording your incidents of racist and other hate? Now, I don't know if that question has been asked as part of our engagement, so I would be interested if that question has been asked. And if it hasn't been asked, could you undertake to ask it, or could you ask one of your officers in the school's improvement team to undertake to at least find out what document are they using? That seems to be a very simple question that won't get anybody into any trouble. And could we see a copy of those documents? And that would at least allow us to sort of sort out those who do have a form and those who don't have a form, and how good the forms are.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to ask schools that question.
So I'll put the link in the chat.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andy.
And I do hope, Chair, that we can, if I am re-elected next month or the month after, if I am re-elected, that I will, and if I'm on this committee, I'll be pursuing this, and I hope whoever succeeds me as the Labour rep on this committee continues to pursue this as well.
Okay, well, as you know, this is something we worked on together to bring to the attention of Sal, and we spoke to Gillian when we wanted to put this on. And when later this meeting, we'll be talking about the forward programme for Children's Services, ONS. So please do speak up there if there's something.
You're absolutely right. We were looking at hate in the broader context, and maybe that's perhaps the first thing the borough could do, is to update the form from a racist incident reporting form to a more a form of wide application which records all incidents of hate.
Yeah, I think we also raised the question of whether the staff and the governors within our schools are reflecting the communities that they serve. And that was something that I was quite interested to understand, how reflective of our communities the governing bodies are, and what schools are doing to recruit governors from every ethnic background, so that we've got their input at that level as well.
Chair, can I ask my question? Yep.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. My question is on page 27, workforce. I'm just interested in this, proportionality and inclusivity. It says for children to be taught by racially diverse teachers. Fine, that's great. But are they going to be, look, the wrong word is quota, but is it supposed to reflect the balance of racially diverse people across the UK, or just within our own boundaries, or will it even reflect in the school? So there may be some schools which have very different numbers, ratios of different cultures, and I wondered how prescriptive this thing was. Is it going to be set down by national numbers regardless of what the children are in the school, or must it reflect who they are teaching in those particular schools? And if they have to reflect the percentages in some way, proportionality on a proportional basis, like we do with committees and so on, how would that work in terms of changing the numbers if the school changes its children's levels of inclusivity across different cultures? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense, and I think that kind of hit some of the nail on the head in the latter part there, in respect of, we know schools, communities change, and they change year on year. They change, through churn every 5 to 7 years. I think what we're seeking to achieve through the programme, and like I said, it's a very long-term programme, is that our schools have provision in their recruitment arrangements to ensure, or to make sure that their staffing and governor complements more closely align to the diversity of the community that they serve. So at this stage, we're not putting on, and there aren't any kind of national prescribed proportions. There aren't even any locally prescribed proportions. But actually, the programme is about working with schools to understand how their recruitment processes and how our recruitment processes may need some level of adaptation to ensure that we become, and they become, and the system becomes much more
flexible, I suppose.
Flexible, yeah. and holds a diverse community of staff in the same way that our communities are diverse.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. I think that's going to be an interesting one to see how that develops. Okay. Thank you for that.
Prue, did you have an additional question?
Yes, it's not a question. It's just, while we've been talking, I have been round all the secondary school sites in the borough, apart from St Crispin's, I haven't quite got to yet. And all of them have anti-bullying policies with racism mentioned specifically. Bullmarsh is slightly mixed up with its behaviour policy. All the rest have a separate policy which mentions racism, except for Bowhunt, where I can't find any policies at all. So that's not particularly good, but the rest of them all have got racism in there as a factor that they are concerned about. So I think we should be encouraged by that.
Thank you for doing that research, Prue. If you'd like to continue with the primary schools, we'd be very interested.
Do you want to join one of my teams?
Not this evening.
Yeah. I did want to ask you, we have got 45 schools involved in the training being provided by Amjad. And I just wondered if they were mostly secondary, or we have got lots of our primary schools involved as well.
I believe we've got lots of primary schools involved. I'd need to ask my team for the breakdown.
Thank you. Right, thank you very much for that, Sal. And we were asked to simply note this report, which I think we've done more than that, so thank you very much. Next item on the agenda, 59, we're looking at...
Chair?
Yeah?
I'm not sure if it's going to be noted that this wasn't quite, let's say, the report that we were expecting, certainly that I was expecting. The report has obviously plenty of value in its own right, but I don't think it reflects what I was expecting, and certainly what I wanted when this conversation started in the middle of last year.
I think you're right, Andy. I think originally we spoke about the need for challenging racism and how we can monitor our progress in achieving that, which would involve obviously recording all of the racial hate crime incidents in schools. And we would certainly expect that with all the input through training and other workshops, that perhaps year on year we will see a reduction in that. But unless we've got a clear monitoring process, there is nothing to assess the progress that we're making in challenging, combating, deterring, and ultimately, removing any racism from our schools.
I said that it's just in terms of, is this the report we asked for?
If I may, Andy, and as I said previously, I'm sorry that this report doesn't reflect what you're expecting. Unfortunately, given that we don't have the ability to compel schools to share that information with us, it's incredibly difficult for me to present a report to committee based on information that I may not be able to receive, especially if committee is seeking to have a consistent approach to that. I think what I'm seeking to do, or what we're seeking to do through this piece of work, is really, again, raise the status and raise the awareness of racial equity and all of the things that impacts on with our schools system, to try and move towards that more coherent and consistent approach across the system. I just want to, share with colleagues that because I don't want to raise an expectation of a report that I truly don't believe at this point in time that I'm able to deliver.
I would much rather that we reconfirm the fact that the borough schools are unwilling to work together to produce a consistent method of monitoring racist incidents. Let's reconfirm that for 2021. I would much prefer we did that. I mean, let's face it, the report you have produced, it also consists of things that we don't have the power to make schools do. I mean, they've entered into everything they've done voluntarily because there is a willingness to do so. And I appreciate this might be a harder thing for schools to talk about, but we need to start doing it. We can't just say, well, we can't do this, or we're unwilling to state the difficulty of the problem. That's, at the moment, we've just ignored it, and we can't do that. We need to talk to the schools and engage with the schools and say, you need to make a start, guys, because I just don't think it's acceptable that we cannot measure racism in our schools, and that's what we're saying.
Carol.
So, okay, with respect to the overview and scrutiny, it's really difficult for this to be in this space because this is scrutiny of children's services, and this is not a children's services. This is you're asking for something for our schools to do that we can't compel our schools to do it, and therefore this forum in this sense is perhaps the wrong place to have this conversation. I'd say it would be, because you're scrutinising children's services in this forum, and this is something that we have not got the authority in the current arrangements of children's services to be able to do anything about in this forum. However, what I would say is, if you could email me, Andy, with what you actually request and would like to see happen, we can take that offline as a separate piece of work that we can then work with schools to think about how we take that forward as you've requested it. But it doesn't feel like that it's right to have it as overview and scrutiny as part of scrutinising children's services when it's an activity that we want schools to undertake, that it's a school's responsibility. It isn't actually children's services responsibility.
I absolutely understand that, but having said that, the whole report has been about things that we cannot make the schools do. But because
we obviously want to be as helpful as we can be as children's services.
Yes.
When members ask us to go away and do a piece of work, we try to go away and adhere to the requests of that work. It's clear from this, from this evening, that we haven't quite hit the mark in relation to what you originally had asked us to do. But I do think we're trying to scrutinise children's services on something that hasn't got, control over in this setting. I would suggest that we can look at what your original request was, Andy, and I can have conversations with head teachers about, you and other members' concerns about that, and to in another forum, because we've also got Children and Young People's Partnership, which is a systems leadership approach to things that we need to tackle collectively, and we've got a learning event in May, and one of the things on the learning event is how do we tackle wicked issues together, one of which is lots of things, but one of which is is racism in our community following the George Floyd incident and things like COVID and other things, children's mental health, etc. So we flagged it as a kind of wicked issue for the partnership to tackle, and we can then collectively come up with ways in which that we can demonstrate and evidence and measure our approach collectively as a system. That might be a better forum, and I'm very happy at a later point to then bring the work of that system's leadership direction of travel for children in the borough collectively as a system back to Overview and Scrutiny as we're the lead organisation in that piece of work. And then we can pick that up there rather than, because clearly we haven't quite hit the mark with what your request is, but I don't, because it's not children's services per se that we're trying to scrutinise here, we're asking for a piece of work to be done with responsibilities for schools. And I, as DCS, cannot direct schools to keep that, to make a record of what you're asking them to. It's not within my DCS responsibilities. Or
can I add something to that very quickly? One sentence, which is, as a school governor, I find it rather insulting that Andy should assume that schools don't want to do something about racism, and in fact quite a lot of them already are, and I find that quite annoying that your assumption is that we have to force them to do it. We don't. They're trying to do it.
And it may be that we just need to help them to find a way to do it collectively, Prue. That might be what we're asking them to do. Is
indeed, but a lot of them are trying to work at it really hard.
I think it's just a matter of comparing school on school, because if they're reporting it slightly different, it's a bit like we have members of staff reporting abuse, let's say verbal abuse of, one member of staff would say that hits that threshold for me to report that through the health and safety executive, and another member of staff would say, oh no, it doesn't quite hit the threshold in my mind. So it's about that. How are we setting out our principles of what we mean, and therefore giving sort of a framework for schools, at least a framework that gives some similarity. I think that's what you're kind of saying, Andy, is there's no kind of baseline similarity or agreed kind of.
That's what is on the borough's children's schools hub. That's what it says there, and that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
If there's no standardisation, schools.
Yeah, I'm happy to get that offline and to build it into the learning event we have in May. But it would be really helpful for me if you very specifically can write me the email in specifically in relation to what it is that you'd like answered, and then I can take that into that arena.
I'll do that.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so we will move to the next item on the agenda, where we're going to be looking at elective home education. And that's back to Sal. Thank you.
Sorry, colleagues, it's you're stuck with me again for this one. Again, in terms of there was a report that previously came to Overview and Scrutiny in respect of elective home education. So this is a bit of an update, but it's also to provide some information around elective home education in the context of COVID as well, and what we've seen happen in Wokingham and what we've seen elsewhere as well. So you will be aware that as the local authority, we have oversight for all education and employment and training for children up until the age of 18, and that includes an element in relation to elective home education in respect of assessing the quality or assuring the quality of curriculum that's provided. And by curriculum, I don't necessarily mean the national curriculum, as parents who choose to electively home educate are not bound to the national curriculum in terms of teaching, but they do have to provide evidence and an assurance that what they are teaching at home is holistic and in the best interests of their children. And we start with the key point that elective home education is an active choice, and as a choice in and of itself, it is not a bad choice. It is just a different choice to having children in mainstream education or independent education. many parents who choose to electively home educate will do so for a variety of reasons. Coming to the current context, what we have seen since the start of the pandemic is a significant increase in the numbers of parents choosing to electively home educate their children. So in this academic year, we've seen an increase of just shy of 22.5% in terms of parents choosing to electively home educate. And as that stands, that's fairly comparable, although just slightly below what we know to be the southern region and the national picture. But it's generally in line with that. As I've said, there are a number of reasons why parents will choose to electively home educate. And we've done some work to try and understand what's behind that jump in terms of that big increase. And what we are hearing from the vast majority of parents that have chosen to home educate in this academic term are three key areas, really. One which is around COVID anxiety, so being unclear or uncertain, or some worry around school environment, the mixing of children and adults, and therefore the propensity for potential onward transmission of the virus, and therefore that whole anxiety around COVID being a reason to not want to send children back to school and to choose to electively home educate. For some families, the experience of lockdown and supporting their children through remote learning and that additional engagement with their children around education, for some families, they feel that that's been a real success, and therefore they're making a life choice in order to continue that way of tutoring and teaching their children. And so actually it's for them, it's a real kind of silver lining or positive outcome from lockdown, in that they want to continue to electively home educate their children. And then there's another group that are very clear that actually the reason that they are currently choosing to electively home educate is a temporary position for them, that they are happy that when things restabilise in the education environment and they stop seeing schools open and close other than to eligible groups, that they will then be looking to return their children back into mainstream education. And therefore, so again, kind of linked, but not necessarily the same as the COVID anxiety. This one is much more about the consistency and the stability of their children's educational experience, which is why they're seeking to electively home educate. When families choose to electively home educate or decide to, our Education Welfare Services provides a support service both to schools and to parents and families in order to support the right decision and making sure that families are making the right decision as it relates to their children and the way in which they want to deliver their education. And so far, another piece of the work that we have to do is, as I said earlier, is that we have to assess that suitability of education. So our Education Welfare Service is in contact, or does get into contact, with every single family that chooses to electively home educate. And we are there and we are open for those families should they seek additional support whilst they're electively home educated. And at the time of drafting this report, we had 221 electively home educated children, and of that, we had already visited or met with the vast majority of families, and I think we had about 57 left to see at that particular point in time. It should be noted that other than the assessment of suitability of education, families, again, in this instance, are not compelled to have any engagement with the local authority. They can choose, and many do, choose not to engage with us and happily carry on educating their children at home without any intervention from the council or from others. We do track our monthly information in respect of elective home education, and again, this is part of us seeking to assure ourselves that those choosing to electively home educate are doing so for the right reasons, for their reasons, and ensuring that families or parents are not being coached into elective home education where, by schools or otherwise, where that might be inappropriate for that child. So we do track where it comes from. And what we've seen over this period is some particular spikes, in particular in parts of the borough. So we're also trying to explore what some of those spikes may be. I'll give one example in the report, but there are many. The example that I gave in respect of Gypsy, Roma and Travelly children links to the south of the borough and why we might see a particular spike, for example, at Bowhunt. We're not suggesting by any means that there is a problem within that community, but as we've seen before in terms of the types of responses for why people are choosing to electively home educate, that community will also have a sense of wanting to make sure that they have that stable, consistent education for children rather than going in and coming out and going in and coming out. So that's one of the areas that we're exploring, but there are others as well in terms of making sure that we really understand why we're seeing more elective home educations in some part of the borough, whereas we're not in other parts of the borough. Again, like I say, that's just one example that was provided. And so alongside all of that is making sure that we're attuned to the welfare of children, both in terms of the decision making about elective home education, as well as in terms of the suitability of the education that they provide, as well as where appropriate, any other welfare issues that may arise, that occasionally from time to time do, but it should be stressed that that's occasionally rather than the norm. More than happy to take some questions.
Okay, Prue, that's it.
Thank you, Alison. My question is, you refer in that thing below figure 2 to Bowhunt and Bearwood, but I couldn't see Bearwood School in the table. I think it's been left out of the table unless I'm seeing things. I just couldn't see.
No, Prue, you're absolutely right.
Yeah. So if we could have the figure for that, would be handy. But I did want.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I will do. Sorry, my apologies.
Okay. I wanted to say something about that Bowhunt number, and then to ask you something else. So, what shall I call it? Anecdotally, there seems to be a feeling that Bowhunt, that this home education is arising because Bowhunt is using it as a way of off-rolling pupils who may not have a very good attendance record or very good prospects for their exams. And is there any truth in any of that as far as you're aware, or is anybody looking at that? That's the first question. And the other side of it is, do we have any feelings that some people may be withdrawing their children from school because of religious concerns or concerns about things like sex education or things that children are now taught about relationships and sexual orientation and things like that. Do we have any feeling that there are some children who are, I'm not going to call it religious fundamentalists, but some sort of religious objection to what's happening in state schools? Do we have any guidance around that?
Okay, in respect of the first question, yes, we do explore and we are exploring and trying to understand that particular peak in Bowhunt. At the moment, I haven't got any of the information to either prove or disprove the hypothesis that you proposed there, Prue. But it is, one of those areas, as it is with all schools, about ensuring, as I said, that any decision to electively home educate is the right one for families and parents, that it's not subject to inordinate pressure by any school in order to remove children from role. So we do take that incredibly seriously. And in respect of your second question, it's not been highlighted to me that children or parents are choosing to electively home educate based on religious or cultural backgrounds, specifically in relation to sex and relationships education. So I don't necessarily have any data, again, to suggest that that's a specific issue in Wokingham.
It was a fear that was raised, I think, when things changed, wasn't it? And I don't know. I'm reassured in some ways to hear you say that. Thank you.
And I think that parents, if they do have any religious or cultural reasons why they would not wish their children to engage in PSHE in relation to sex and relationships education, there is the facility and capacity for them to liaise with the school to have their children removed from such lessons rather than remove those children from the school.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Prue. Thank you, Sam. Malcolm.
Yes, thank you. A couple of comments and a couple of questions. During COVID-19, most parents have had to do home education. They were expected to because the schools were closed, and unless their parents were on the front line, key workers and so on, they were expected to educate at home, which meant that the children were at home, and of course parents were not being prosecuted in any way for not sending them to school because they couldn't. But they were not doing it voluntarily, and I suspect the majority of them, from what I've seen on news reports and in papers and so on, is that the majority of parents were quite glad for their kids to go back to school, because it's all very well if you're doing fairly simple stuff within the average parent's knowledge, but when you're getting onto things like science or history or geography or physical education or anything, where the parents are not geared to doing that, then it's quite tricky. So it's just better for them to be in a school. And we don't assess parent suitability necessarily, do we? We only check that the home environment is safe. We don't check that the parents have sufficient knowledge to deliver that. So I was wondering if you had any views. Why did you think parents elected for home education when in fact it was being forced on them anyway? Do you think it was simply to avoid them having to send them to school, get them back home, educate them, send them back and forth? Was it for consistency, you think, to do that? Second question is, what happens when a selective home educated child, lifestyle or whatever, the parents realise that they can't teach the subject adequately in their opinion, or fairly easily identify that they can't? What happens to the child? Does it go back to the last school it was registered in, or does it apply, do the parents apply as if they're new residents in the area and ferret around trying to find a suitable school? Those are two questions. I think I have a third one depending on how long this answer takes.
Okay. So in terms of the first question, when parents were supporting their children through remote education as a result of the lockdown, that wasn't and isn't considered to be elective home education. Elective home education is where there is a active decision by parents to remove their children from a school role and educate them at home. So those parents, whilst, the vast majority of parents that have been supporting children throughout the lockdown through remote education that's been provided by schools, are not seen as elective home educators. For those, though, that when schools have returned, there are some families that have said, actually, I've quite enjoyed doing that with my children and I wish to continue to do it. So I now want to electively home educate them and therefore take them off the school roll. In respect of the second question, which does absolutely relate to elective home education, in terms of the assessment of suitability, we don't necessarily assess the home. We don't assess parents. We assess the suitability of their plans for the education of their children, and thinking through the types of things and the types of resources that parents may choose to utilise in supporting the education of their children. So it's not about assessing parents, and it's not about assessing parents' homes. However, it is recognised that parents who choose to electively home educate, not all of them, some of them are, but not all of them, are trained educators, and therefore they don't necessarily have the experience to deliver what is currently delivered through a school curriculum, but they might choose to teach other things. We do know that some families also bring in tutors as part of to tutor their children in subject areas as part of their elective home education arrangements. And then the third part of the question in relation to should they choose to come back to school is, given that they've removed their child from a school role, they then do have to make an in-year admission to get back into school. So it's not necessarily guaranteed that they will be able to return their children to the school that they were originally at. They go into the normal admissions arrangement to identify a new school place for them.
Right, thank you. So if they've been out of a school environment and a conventional sort of curriculum and a timescale and so on, they might have fallen quite a long way behind all the other children. Is that taken into account in any way when, if they decide to send the child back to school, the child could be a year behind everybody else or even further? How is that handled? Are they assessed in any way to see, which school is appropriate or where they would start? I
think each school will undertake its own arrangements for understanding where their students are at in relation to the taught curriculum. And it will happen not just for elective home education children, but it will happen for children that are moving in the area. So schools will take account of previous school reports. But it might also be the case where you have children, for example, that are unaccompanied asylum seekers. So they have to go to school. So schools will assess and work with those children around what are their additional learning needs to enable them to re-engage or engage with the school's taught curriculum. So it will vary from child to child and establishment to establishment. But yes, there will be some form of understanding where that child's at and therefore how to re-engage them. Some children coming out of elective home education, they may be beyond where the school's at, dependent on what the parents have been teaching those children.
Yeah. So if they have fallen behind, it's done as if they just moved to the area anyway. But if a lot of people went into the home ed, and I think you said it went up by about 22% or something, that could have quite an impact on their ability to maintain their existing or previous standards as a school. If they suddenly have a 10 or 15% extra people coming back in who've not been taught to the same standards, that could have quite an impact on the results, couldn't it? As a school.
I suppose dependent on where and which schools, if there was a mass return,
Yeah.
Potentially that could be an issue. I'm not necessarily sure that is a significant risk for the schools in Wokingham, given the profile of our elective home education cohort. I mean, the cohort itself, 220 children, accounts for about 1% of the entire school population.
Okay, right. Last question for them then. If you do decide to do home education and they've taken the children out of school, are they required to give a reason for it? For instance, touched on earlier by a previous speaker, do they say it's religion or the subjects that are taught, or they don't like the way things work at that school or the location of the school? Do they have to give a reason why they're taking it out, or can they just arbitrarily say, I want to teach them at home?
Yeah, I mean, most parents will have a very clear rationale as to why they're seeking to electively home educate, but there isn't a set procedural route that says it has to have a specific rationale. Parents can just choose to say, no, actually, I wish to electively home educate my child, and they don't necessarily have to give masses of detail. Many parents do choose to share with us why they choose to electively home educate. And we know that there's a big variety of reasons, many of which are lifestyle choices.
Right. So last point then, it's a bit more difficult to answer really. If someone's been home educated for 2 or 3 years, and that you could do it up until they're 18, couldn't you? So if they've been home educated poorly for 2, 3, 4 years, that will have quite an impact on the child's ability, for instance, to apply for jobs and to show competence and skill, because they don't necessarily get to take the exams, do they? They're not obliged to take any measurement exams when they leave the school, are they? So how would they prove their educational skills and improve their job chances for job? It would seem to be a limitation, wouldn't it? And who picks up the responsibility for that then?
So many children that are electively home educated do actually take exams, and we have schools that support access to exam centres to enable that to happen.
And the parents have to pay for those exams themselves then, don't they? I guess.
Yeah, because that's their choice not to have their children within the mainstream education premise. But that doesn't discount children that have been electively home educated from undertaking qualifications and exams. I think as much as there may be challenges for some young people as they kind of almost end their electively home education career, there are also just as many real positives in terms of parents will often or many parents will also use their experience and their skill set to equip their children well for the employment market or the post-learning market. So you do actually see some children that come from electively home education and go on into university education and so forth. So it's not in and of itself a limiting factor, but it does have a wide variety of both challenges and opportunities.
Okay, thank you for that clarification then. Thanks very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Sal, that does bring me to a question that was on my mind. Currently, our students won't be sitting GCSE or A-level exams. It's all going to be done by teacher assessment. How can our electively home educated children obtain the qualifications that they would have gone to an exam centre to sit when they haven't got a teacher to submit to the DFE the assessment to obtain the qualification? What's going to happen this year?
It's quite an interesting point you raised there. We are looking to colleagues within the DFE to provide a bit further guidance in respect of elective home education and qualifications. One of the biggest challenges that we do have in this arena is, whilst as the local authority we have a number of various responsibilities, in terms of assessing suitability and those sorts of things of children's learning. The guidance and the legal framework for us to engage around that is really not evident. So there's a big consultation going on at the moment nationally around the role of the local authority in relation to electively home education, and we're trying to push to kind of also, sort of in the current context, answer some of those questions, because it was really difficult at the end of the last academic year in terms of that whole, it's really difficult for all children in exam phases, but particularly challenging for those young people in elective home education that were going to be sitting in exam centres. Unfortunately, we just don't have the clear answers to that question, but it is something that we're constantly chasing DfE to try and understand from their perspective what's going to happen in the same way that they've given guidance for other children and their exams.
Yes, thank you. I've got a couple of questions, if I may. Have I understood correctly that parents can opt out of visits from the education officer? And if so, how common is it? And if a parent opts out from home visits, what sort of monitoring does the Education Welfare Service continue with?
So parents can opt out. They have to engage. And the very vast majority of parents that choose to electively home educate do engage with us. It's just the once in terms of that suitability assessment. There are some that choose quite clearly that they don't want anything to do with the local authority or maintained education. And we do our very best to support that view, but at the same time, as I said previously, we're also minded to a whole raft of other things in respect of children that are not educated within a mainstream setting. So we do take due account of other things in order to assess our level of concern or risk for those children. Like I say, in the vast majority of cases, it's not a concern and a worry for us, because many parents do engage with us.
Okay, and then a kind of a follow-up question, similar sort of theme. Are there occasional surveys of the parents who opt for homeschooling? For example, tracking the reasons why they've chosen this route. Any concerns that the parents might be having about the process, including the roles, the effectiveness of the Education Welfare Service?
So again, when parents choose or seek to register for elective home education and share that with schools to say we want to take our child off the school roll, the school alerts us that the child's going to be taken off school roll, and we do at that point try to ascertain the rationale and the reasons for why parents choose to electively home educate. And we know that there's a real variety of reasons. I've highlighted in the report 3 key ones as it relates to the particular upturn that we've seen in terms of the COVID context. But we also know that for many parents, it will be life choice. For some parents, it will be a sense of dissatisfaction in relation to their experience of mainstream education or the experience of their children for mainstream education. And unfortunately, there will be times where actually there are concerns where parents have been encouraged to electively home educate their children rather than maintain them on a school roll, commonly known as off-rolling. So we do explore all of those reasons and rationales to best support parental decision making, not to force parents in any given way, but to best understand and support that decision making.
I guess my intention with that question was more about ongoing engagement with parents. After the initial decision, to begin elective homeschooling. I guess it's a question about parents' voice. Once their children are being homeschooled, are there sufficient opportunities? Do you feel for the parents to give feedback on their experiences, perhaps in engagement with the Education Welfare Service?
Absolutely. I think parents are able to provide their voice, and we know that many do. But there are also quite a significant proportion of parents that, beyond that kind of initial consultation, actually say, actually, my voice, I want to keep. I don't want to engage with the local authority, and therefore, as an LA, we're not enabled to continue to contact and explore with families necessarily what they are doing. There's no statutory or legislative piece that gives us that type of access into daily family life. So we have to respect that level of privacy when families want it, but also welcome and offer that engagement to families where it would support the provision that they're putting in place for their children. So we do provide advice and guidance. At the same time, from an education welfare service, we sometimes have to be the other side of the coin, where things aren't working well and aren't working in the right interests of children. So where we don't believe that the provision is sufficient or sufficiently acceptable in terms of the nature of the provision, we can do things like 15-day notices, which is about, they need to provide further evidence, or we can enforce the acts to require them to resend their children to school. It's a really, really rare occurrence when that happens, very, very rare occurrence, but we do have those sorts of options should we need them.
No, that's fine. I was going to ask a question about the 15-day notices, but you've just answered that. So thank you very much indeed.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, Sal.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so that brings us to looking at the forward plan, which is on the agenda as a verbal item. As members will know, tomorrow at the Overview and Scrutiny Management Committee, just checking I'm not muted stuff, yes, they will be looking at all of the ideas and suggestions that have been put forward by members, by the public, from the town and parish councils. And there are some of those which have been marked as being perhaps more suitable for Children's Services to look at. Clearly, I think many of the members of this committee have also got suggestions. Lucienne, can you put up the list of what's going to ONS management tomorrow, please?
Yes, sure. Oops, sorry, it's not that one. Just bear with me, just whilst I try to. Just 1 second. Should be coming up soon.
Yes, so what we can see on your screen, these are the items that...
So this is what's in the agenda to be discussed tomorrow at the management committee as items that have been put forward as suggestions for the forward plan. Can scroll down.
Yes, they are. Having looked at the list that's in the OS agenda, the one that's got names against them all and then different items, that's a slightly different list, isn't it?
Yeah, so this is the list of the children's services specific items.
Yes, I mean, that doesn't include some of the things that are on the list that were the OS management going down.
This is within the report that that is going to be discussed tomorrow. But you can add more items if you want to.
Well, I know there's several items with my name against them in the large list put forward, which aren't included in here. So I think we're talking about a slightly different list. But yeah, so members, is there any people want to make comments on what's been put forward? If there's anything missing, if there's any more detail to perhaps some of these items? Laura.
Thank you. I know, Alison, we talked to Neil Carr about getting something on the agenda about missing children. I just couldn't see it in this list, but I know that you mentioned that there's might be another one.
List. I mean, if you go to the agenda for OS management, it's within that list, yeah. Because I looked at it earlier.
Okay, this is the main report with the work programs. Sorry, let me scroll down. Yeah, that was the one for Children's Services ONS.
Yeah, I think it's an agenda item.
Okay.
It's in the agenda for tomorrow.
Yeah.
Yes, page 18, I think it is, page 17, 18, that agenda.
Yeah.
Page 18, let me try.
Page 17, page 18.
Laura's suggestion certainly there.
Yeah, it is, yes.
This is the list where lots of people have put different things forward, and then there's many of them are for OS management, and then there is some of them, if you scroll down, have got Children's Services against some bullying.
Oh, I think this is what you're referring to then from number 35.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, so it's there. That's really good. And then having an update on the racial equity report, is that something to go here, or is that something separate? Like the strategy, because I know it's early days.
Well, no, we're discussing now what we want to have on the forward programme to this committee, May 21 through to April 22. So bringing back an item on challenging racism, and I think Andy's very keen that would include the monitoring of racism in schools.
Chair, can I just say, as a general point, given that the purpose of scrutiny is to try and add some sort of value, as I think you said in council, and to be a critical friend, I'm looking at these and I'm wondering where it is we think we're going to be doing this, because we're doing a lot of reviewing and a lot of listening and a lot of asking questions, but how much is here that we're actually influencing? That would be my general question, because I'm looking at them and I'm not seeing much scope to influence the work of children's services. So that's a general point. I'm sorry?
So if we go back to, I mean, these are just all the suggestions that we've had from all sorts of people to involve, and then we've got the 12 points, Lucian, it's down in the appendix.
Sorry, Alison.
The list that you showed us originally, Lucian.
Oh, you want the other one?
Yeah, because I think that's what we're looking at. I think that's what Andy's talking about more. It's what exactly. Which,
what I wanted, sorry, Alison, I guess what I want to do is to remind us all that we should perhaps be focusing on the things where we think our scrutiny can improve children's services and the work of children's services, rather than the things which perhaps on the surface seem important or interesting. It has to be about improvement, doesn't it?
It's not about what's interesting, is it? It's about ensuring that we're providing the best for every child, and it's overview, which can be about future policy, and perhaps we do need to be more involved in that rather than scrutinising what's currently going on. So So those 17 points, obviously some of them are we always do, looking at the KPIs, reviewing school performances, scrutinising those causing concern. Pauline, got your hand up.
Yep, thank you. I just wanted to say that if you want to change anything, like change any of the wording or add words in to make more of an impact statement, perhaps, such as Andy was suggesting, then now is the time to do it, because in practice, the Overview and Scrutiny Management Committee tomorrow night is just probably going to accept what you've decided this evening, given that you are the committee dealing with children's services. So now is the time to make any changes if you wish to.
Do you want me to stop sharing, Alison?
Well, I mean, looking at this, until you get down to point number 12, perhaps everything is fairly things that we would regularly look at. There's nothing that we're raising particularly. Scrutinising home to school transport was something that I think we had an ambition to look at last year. Andy, looking at appeals, that was something you had raised in the past, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. I mean, I guess I'm sort of thinking, I guess, to do some of these things properly, we need to be looking at them on a recurring basis, on a more regular basis. I mean, like the Corporate Parenting Board, for example, if we take that one, I mean, looking at the annual report of corporate parent of the Corporate Parenting Board isn't going to allow us to influence what the board does. However, if we were to look at it, say, 3 times in the year on an ongoing basis, that might allow us to, perhaps influence the things that they're doing. And it's, the appeals process, again, I get the feeling we need to sort of revisit these things. I mean, it does feel very different. These projects do feel very different to the things we have in Overview and Scrutiny Management, where you've got the big one-offs. These are all recurring things. And I think we need to try, and I'm struggling to articulate it probably, we need to try and get away from just getting the report in and reading the report and asking some questions on it. And it may be this area is more technical, and so it's harder for us to have that sort of influence. I'd be interested to hear what Prue thought about this, for example, because she's got a lot of experience.
And indeed,
you really want to know what I think? Sorry, Alison, am I?
I was going to say, and of course, Prue, you're a member of the Corporate Parenting Board, are you?
I am, yes. Yeah. So there are things which, and the fostering and adoption things, which are in the other list, for example. I'm not sure where that sits. That feels more like Corporate Parenting Board than it does Children's Services, for example. But what I'm not seeing is the strategic planning of Children's Services kind of like coming to us before decisions are made. So we've got a SEND strategy coming, we've got a new, I think, secondary school strategy coming, and surely part of our role is to contribute things to that if we can.
I think number 15.
I can't read that from here because of the size of the print. Sorry.
Number 15 says input into new policies through pre-decision scrutiny of draft policies relating to children's services.
Yes, but we need to know what
they are. That's not a single item, is it? I mean, that's something that we need to be made aware of the draft policies, draft proposals coming forward, so that we can plan them into our programme. Which is why we really would appreciate Carol's input.
But can I say one more thing, which is I feel slightly uneasy about settling all this without really having had the opportunity to think about it when those lists. I hadn't looked at the Overview and Scrutiny Management Committee. I mean, they might allocate us things, which is a separate thing, which I'm not sure I agree with. So I wouldn't want to settle an entire forward programme this evening because there may well be other things that when the new committee's formed in May, may not consist of the same people, may want to do some other things. So can we leave some space in it for them to add?
I think certainly. I think we've always managed, haven't we, to add in extra things to future meetings. It is very important not to pack the agenda, so there's no space to do that. Can I let Carol speak at this point?
Thank you, Alison. I think it's just to your points earlier. I think it was yourself, Alison, and Prue. So children's services is incredibly heavily regulated, and so the thing about kind of repeat things, a lot of what we do is the same. It's about improvement, but it's based on the same kind of regulatory framework and the same. So our strategies are by and large set in relation to meeting our requirements for ILACS inspections, for example, first send inspections, etc. So I'm quite happy to have a conversation about children's services broader improvement strategy and what that means, but it still is regulatory work, because obviously that's what that's what children's services is. It's a very statutorily heavy, regulatory heavy area of council's business. That doesn't mean that we can't kind of sequence in a way that gives overview and scrutiny early sight of those emerging kind of strategies. It may just be that there are some things that we can't alter or change even after going through scrutiny because of the nature of the regulatory framework. Some things have got to be in there, but we can certainly, following May, when we're doing the new members training, we can probably set out some of this in terms of what the kind of the framework of regulation and statutorily delivery models are around children's services, so that it might help us then to think about what would be good to kind of have overview and scrutiny of. Yeah, so that it is difficult. I appreciate it's difficult, and to influence things before they've been kind of concluded, because a lot of them, as I say, are sort of set in stone and we have to do them in a particular way. It's really prescribed in relation to how we have to do them.
Thank you. Pauline.
Thank you. I thoroughly agree with what Carol's just said. And we used to have a training session at the beginning of each municipal year for the Children's Services Scrutiny Committee, in which we went over the sort of things that Carol's just mentioned, like the processes and the things that we statutorily have to do. Because quite a lot of the questions tonight were really just asking, what's the situation with this, and that training would address that. And as Andy said, it's not really scrutiny, just to find out how we do things. But what I was going to say was that it might help members to know that us from after the annual council, the very first scrutiny committee, we're going to ask the executive members to come to that scrutiny committee and tell each committee what's on their own forward programme, so that we can have some input in advance into what they're planning to do. Because several times this year, a document has come to scrutiny which has in effect already been decided, and it's too late for us to have any input. So it is worth leaving a little bit of space for things that might emerge from the executive member on their own forward programme.
Andy.
Thank you. So I guess that's I guess that's a bit of a reminder to Prue then to keep a diary free to come and present to Children's Overview and Scrutiny when she's the lead member for Children's Services next year. I'm assuming her and her colleagues have agreed. Who knows? Who knows? So, and thank you, Carol, for capturing and expressing very, very clearly what I was grasping at about the highly regulated nature of children's services. So I guess perhaps the things we can look at then are the strategies, and as Prue's mentioned, the two strategies which we know are going to be developed, i.e. the secondary school strategy and the SEND strategy. And I know we've already had one session on the SEND strategy. Perhaps we should have a very early sight of the secondary strategy, but also a revisit from the SEND strategy, and that should be ongoing until such time as it's completed as named items.
That's right. So number 14 is reviewing the SEND strategy again, isn't it?
Yes, I think 14 is already there, but
yeah, there's reviewing it before it goes live, and then there's reviewing it for its effectiveness. Yes. So there's two slightly different things, you know. So there's a bit about challenging, and that's an area. So that again, that's the other sort of distinction, and we can ask our partners to come along to Overview and Scrutiny in relation to the SEND strategy, because that's an area strategy. So that's not just children's services, but obviously it is to improve outcomes for children of the borough. Yep. So it's, you know, so that would be appropriate to kind of, you know, be a kind of more partnership, maybe, you know, a one-off slightly longer session specifically in relation to that, if you wanted to do that twice a year around the implementation of the SEND strategy, because it's a co-produced SEND strategy. So, you know, there's a lot of stakeholders in that. Obviously, it was, you know, it has been co-produced, we think, you know, very effectively, but now it's holding us to account collectively to deliver. Yes.
Yeah. But I guess it's going back to the point, hopefully it's about this committee or being involved as the strategy is being developed. I appreciate it's too late in the day for the SEND one, but say with the secondary schools one, for example, I'm assuming it's not too late in the day for us to have an early sight of it and for our comments and to be taken into account.
Yes, that's in its early stages. So yeah, that's absolutely right. The same with the home school transport. We did as you know, we did an all-party kind of early engagement with that. There are definitely things that the committee can have early sight of. There are things that we have to produce that we certainly can take comments and questions on, but whether or not we can completely overhaul them in line with those comments and questions and scrutiny, because, as I say, they're set within the framework of Ofsted. So a lot of it's right.
Yeah, I think we all understand that, but what we don't like seeing is being given a document saying, here it is, and then two weeks later it becoming policy. I think that's what we're trying to avoid is to see stuff as early as possible. So we might have some insight, we might not, and I appreciate the highly regulated environment, but for me it is about is there something useful we can say in the development process, and there might not be, but there also might be.
I have no problem with that at all. So, you know, yes, it's about aligning it with our children's services 3-year strategy that we had a strategy which, you know, is very high level on a page, but then we have a strategic direction, and within that there are key pockets of work, and each of those will have either a strategy or policy or a plan, or, you know, so absolutely. We obviously have to get on with those things more often than ONS. So that's the other bit of it. Some of it is, you know, it's about determining, I think, what's really important to ONS to have overview of an early sight, and then what obviously we've just got to get on and deliver.
Okay, so looking at number 8, we're scrutinising the allocation of school places across the borough, and there have been some parental concern about some of the allocation recently. Is there going to be a review of the way we communicate with schools about the admissions process?
So,
Sal, do you want to take that one?
Yeah. So currently we have a school admissions task group, which is a subset of the schools forum, and that group is specifically set up with predominant membership of schools, but with us to look at school admissions issues in relation to the timescale, as well as how schools admissions plays into the sufficiency. So that group's only just started. It's had one meeting. It's got another one scheduled fairly soon. But certainly the output from those meetings can certainly be provided and fed in to overview and scrutiny, so that there is the opportunity for members to also kind of get their teeth into the work of that group.
Members, any more comments on this proposal that will be going to the meeting tomorrow? Okay, take it that we're all happy with that then. Right, in that case, and if nobody's got anything they want to add, that's the end of the meeting tonight. Thank you very much to everyone attending. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Ola Corinne. And thank you very much to Adam and Sal and to Jonathan. And of course,
Alison. Good night.
a huge Sian, who's done an incredible job this year. Really appreciate all services to Children's Services ONS.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Everyone, good night.
Thank you all. Good night.
Good night.